welcome back to the Sit 'em Stardom podcast here at fantasyfootballcafe.com. I'm your host, Josh Shepardson. You can follow me on Twitter where I post as at BChat50. And jumping right into things, I'm advocating sitting Marcus Mariota this week against the New England Patriots. He saved his fantasy line a little bit last week by catching a touchdown pass. I don't expect him to reach the end zone as a receiver again this week. And while the spread of 14 points, the Titans are 14-point underdogs, points to a game where he should be airing it out a lot. You'd normally like the volume quite a bit and figure that he'd get some garbage time points just on volume alone. But this is not a good matchup for Mariota. Patriots are notorious for being very good about taking away a team's best offensive player. Mariota's best offensive player to throw to is pretty obvious this year. Delanie Walker's been excellent. Patriots have been tough on tight ends as it stands, ranking 11th defending them according to Football Outsiders. So I think it's going to be a long day for Delanie Walker, which probably means a long day for Marcus Mariota. Making matters worse for the rookie quarterback, so the Patriots rank second in the league in sacks this season, and his team has allowed the second most sacks of their quarterbacks this season. And that's obviously not all Marcus Mariota's fault. Zach Mettenberger started a few games. And, that's largely on the offensive line, but not a good combination. They've generated a pass rush this year, and when it turns into predictable passing downs, Mariota's going to be picking himself up off the ground quite often. I don't see him putting up enough fantasy points this week to be a top 12 signal caller. Moving on to running back, I'm going to advocate sitting a guy who is a feature back, and that almost seems crazy at this time of year where at this point in the season where running backs have dropped like flies. I mean, Thomas Rawls went down last week. And there have just been countless injuries at the position. Jamal Charles, Le'Veon Bell. So to sit a feature back is a tough pill to swallow, but making it a little easier is that Darren McFadden is facing the #1 run defense in the league, and it's not close. The Jets have been unbelievable. They're holding opponents to under 80 yards rushing per game, and they've allowed just 2 rushing touchdowns, so allowing the fewest yards per game to running backs and allowing the fewest touchdowns so far this year. So there's not a lot to like here. McFadden did go over 100 yards on just 9 carries last week, but he'd been slumping a little bit before that. And this is a Cowboys offense that just cannot generate points. They have an over-under total this week of 19. And Matt Castle's looked terrible. Kellen Moore has been getting some first-team reps this week. Kellen Moore is not going to be a savior. He should be. I mean, he can't. It doesn't seem like he could be worse than Matt Castle at this point. So maybe he gives a slight jolt of life to the team, but we're not talking about a guy who's going to come in there and make this offense hum like it probably would be with Tony Romo under center. And without them moving the ball, they're not going to be in position to score touchdowns. And as I already noted, I mean, this is a run defense that's only allowed 2 touchdowns on the ground anyway. So McFadden's odds of reaching pay dirt were slim anyway. They're even slimmer with an offense that just probably isn't going to be in a lot of scoring positions this week. McFadden is fringe viable as a flex or a low-end RB2 in PPR leagues. Because the quarterbacks are so bad and limited, probably going to catch a few checkdowns against this defense. And if the Cowboys end up playing catch-up, it's going to be more passing attempts, more cheap points. If it's anything less than a full point per reception, though, McFadden's a pretty easy guy to go to the bench. And in standard scoring leagues, there's no way I'm running him out there. Moving on to receiver, one of the more popular plays at the selections at the position this year, early round pick, was Emmanuel Sanders. He's coming off of a monster first season with the Broncos. He and Peyton Manning were clicking on all cylinders. Obviously, Manning has not been clicking on all cylinders this year. Brock Osweiler's coming to start 4 games. He and Sanders have played together for 3 of those games. Sanders was hurt for the first start of Osweiler's NFL career. And in that first game, he erupted for 113 yards receiving on 6 receptions with Osweiler throwing the ball. That was against the Patriots on Sunday Night Football. Great game. Sanders looked good. But since then, he's caught just 5 of 14 targets for 36 yards receiving with 0 touchdowns in back-to-back contests. Osweiler's not getting the football. 14 targets, not an exceptionally high number, but not so low that if Osweiler were efficient and getting the football to Sanders and a place for him to catch the football and do things with it, you could live with the average of 7 targets per game over the last 2 weeks. That hasn't been the case. I mean, he's caught essentially a third the targets, his direction the last 2 games. Hasn't even bested 40 yards receiving in the 2 games combined. And the Broncos are not finding the end zone with any regularity with Osweiler starting. They bested 20 points scoring against the Patriots with Osweiler as a starter. That's the only time that they've done that in 4 games with Brock starting. So this offense is not moving the football. Emmanuel Sanders is not doing much with the change of quarterback. And while the matchup looks good, I mean, the Steelers have been terrible defending receivers this year. And you could throw in the whole narrative street story of Emmanuel Sanders facing his former club, wants to show out since he didn't do a heck of a lot there, yada, yada, yada. None of it matters if Brock Osweiler can't get him the football. Have not been on the same page since that first game that the two played together against the Patriots. Now is not the time to bank on them magically having chemistry, not in the fantasy football playoffs, not in a position where they're seemingly always at least a decent streaming option or a decent option on your bench with a better matchup. I would start a guy like Ted Ginn Jr. over Emmanuel Sanders just to give you some perspective. So Emmanuel Sanders not a guy that should be started this week. Another guy who is a high-ish pick was Travis Kelce. Expected a big breakout this season. I did anyway, and a number of others as well. But it just hasn't been the case. He's taken a slight statistical step forward this season. Probably going to post he's posting his highest yards per game after posting a nice number last year in his first season, healthy enough to play. And going to set some personal highs after turning in a good season last year, but didn't take that leap forward that many expected. And the biggest problem of late is that Alex Smith is throwing the ball to Jeremy Maclin a ton. Used Albert Wilson last week, just not throwing the ball to Travis Kelce as much as you'd like. Kelce's been targeted just 8 times over the last 2 games, caught 5 of those passes for 60 yards and a touchdown. And if he played great defenses, maybe you chalk it up to just a bad matchup. Those are 2 games where he should have scored fantasy points, should have done damage. Faced the Raiders. The Raiders have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points per game to tight ends this year. Didn't do much there. Also faced the Chargers, who've allowed the 8th most fantasy points to tight ends per game this year. Did almost nothing there. So if he's not putting up numbers in favorable matchups, don't expect him to put up numbers in an unfavorable matchup this week against the Ravens. Ravens have allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points to tight ends, and they've allowed a ton of points to receivers. So expect another Maclin showing and not a lot from Travis Kelce. Kelce needs to be glued to benches, and I would start Richard Rodgers, Ben Watson, and Zach Miller, among others, over Travis Kelce this week. Moving on to the stardom side of things, pretty much a theme of the bulk of the season. You start your quarterbacks against the New Orleans Saints. Now, hasn't worked out with Jameis Winston. He seems to be the only quarterback that can't put up big numbers against the Saints. But otherwise, if you started quarterbacks against the Saints this year, you've done pretty well for yourself. That's going to be the case again this week with Matthew Stafford traveling to New Orleans. He's played well with Jim Bob Cooter as the offensive coordinator. Since the Week 9 bye, he's averaging 265.2 yards per game passing with 11 touchdowns and just a pair of interceptions. Also adding some value with his legs. I don't put a lot of stock in him continuing to run well, but he did rush for a touchdown, averaging about 15 yards rushing per game in that time frame. So maybe he gives you a little bit more with the legs as well. But, I mean, that's not really Stafford's game. It's a nice thing to see, but I'm more impressed with the touchdown-interception ratio and the fact that he's thrown for multiple scores in all but 1 game since that Week 9 bye. So he's playing at a high level, and he's playing against the Saints team that's allowed 36 passing touchdowns this year. No other teams allowed even 30 touchdown passes this year. They've given up the 3rd most passing yards per game at 278.8, and it's pretty easy to see that they are the worst pass defense in the league. Football Outsiders agrees. Anybody with a functioning brain basically agrees, and they've allowed more fantasy points per game to quarterbacks than any other team, and by a wide margin. Get Matthew Stafford in there. He looks like a top 10 scorer at the position this week. Moving on to running back, another high pick that really has disappointed most of the year. Seemed to kind of get out of that funk in Week 12 and 13. Went back into it last week, but get Jeremy Hill back in your lineups this week. Last week, the Bengals fell behind with A.J. McCarron taking over for Andy Dalton. Really couldn't rely on the running game. We're playing catch-up pretty early, and unfortunately that resulted in a bad showing from Jeremy Hill, at least unfortunately for those who used him. But the prior 2 weeks he'd been running well. He'd rushed for 98 yards in week 13 with a score, and he ran for 86 yards in week 12. So putting up some yardage, has a nose for the end zone when they get in that red zone, and facing a Niners team that was just absolutely flat out embarrassed by the Cleveland Browns rushing attack that ran for 230 yards against them in Cleveland last week. Niners have been better at home, but they've allowed the second most rushing yards per game to running in the league this year at 133.2. They've allowed 16 rushing touchdowns, which is the third most rushing touchdowns allowed this year. And no team has surrendered more fantasy points per game to running backs than the 49ers. They are in a bad way right now. They can't stop the run. And with A.J. McCarron once again playing quarterback for the Bengals, got to expect Hugh Jackson's going to lean on his backs a little bit, make life a little bit easier for the quarterback making his first NFL start. So I'd expect Jeremy Hill to get upwards of 18 to 20 carries, maybe catch a ball or two out of the backfield. He can do that on occasion. Gio Bernard is really their pass catching back, but Hill has at least shown that aptitude in the past. But this is a game where Hill should be force-fed the ball, and the 49ers are going to have to prove that they can stop the run. They haven't been able to all year. I like Hill here. I like him actually as a high-end RB2, even with the threat of Giovanni Bernard getting touches as well. At wide receiver, I will be starting Michael Floyd, and you should be too. He's not the number one receiver for the Cardinals. That distinction still belongs to Larry Fitzgerald. But this passing attack has been awesome with Carson Palmer this year, and they can sustain more than one viable receiver. And Michael Floyd has really been the second best receiver for the club this year, better than John Brown, better than the emerging J.J. Nelson, and he's bested 100 yards receiving in 4 of his last 5 games, shaking off that slow start that came while he was recovering from a hand injury. He's shown no ill effects of that lately. He scored 6 touchdowns in his last 7 games. And, he's torched good secondaries. He embarrassed the Seattle Seahawks on Sunday Night Football. And this Eagles secondary is not that of the Legion of Boom. They have allowed a ton of fantasy points, the 3rd most fantasy points to wide receivers this year, and the 9th most passing yards, the 2nd most touchdown passes. So really a soft secondary that doesn't have many answers for receivers this year. Floyd should turn in a big effort, even as the second fiddle to Larry Fitzgerald. At tight end, we're going to wrap things up with Julius Thomas getting the tout as your start play. I'm actually considering starting him over Delaney Walker in a 12-team league, just to kind of give you an idea of how high I am on Julius Thomas this week. My only reservations are the fact that I also own Denard Robinson and Allen Robinson, and I'm a little worried about cannibalizing production from one another. But if I had just had Walker and Thomas on the same team and no other Jaguars cannibalize that production, I'd actually already have Julius Thomas in my lineup. But I do have some fears. But anyways, that aside, good matchup for Thomas this week. Falcons have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends this year per game, according to Pro Football Reference. And they've coughed up 8 touchdown grabs. And the 8 touchdown grabs are noteworthy because Julius Thomas is on a bit of a touchdown binge of late. He's scored a touchdown in 4 straight games, added another touchdown earlier in the season. And even with both Allen Robinson and Allen Hurns healthy last week, Thomas was able to get his piece of the pie, really in 5 receptions for 54 yards and the previously mentioned touchdown grab. So he's playing better of late. If nothing else, he's got a nose for the end zone, and Bortles goes his direction once they get there. And it's a good matchup with the Falcons. So he's looking like a top 10 scorer at the position of me this week. So if you have some needs at tight end, if you've got Julius Thomas on your roster and maybe another fringy starter, get Thomas in there over him. Thomas looks like he's got a good matchup and is a guy that I expect to put some points on the board. That's going to wrap things up. Check out fantasyfootballcafe.com for our articles, video podcasts, and our active forum that are there to help you win your fantasy football matchups and hopefully get you a fantasy football title here this year. Until next week, good luck.